Good morning.
All right, so Thornabar, to answer your question, especially if you already know natural selection, the simplest answer is natural selection or artificial selection is just natural selection, except it's not nature doing the choosing, it's humans. So in natural selection, like with the moths, it was the predators choosing the dark moths to survive, so to speak, because they were eating the light moths. So nature was selecting against being light. And natural selection, like if you want to, you started with one type of apple, but someone's like, you know what, I want to make a Granny Smith apple, and that happened way back in history. And someone said, all right, if all these, we've got all these different variations of colors. They're mostly red, but this one's slightly green. That one from that tree slightly green. Let's make those. And they just did that over and over. All right, that one's slightly green. This one's the other one that's most slightly green. They kept doing that over and over and over. Or like the example from the slide was horses. There used to be wild horses, and they said we need a big horse. So they would look at all the different horses they have, like that's the biggest male, that's the biggest female. Let's make them. Generation after generation of choosing which trait they wanted to, you know, make more of or less of. That's it. And really, the only question there might be like one question about artificial selection on the exam. Ironically, I think your book brings up artificial selection because we're used to it as humans, because everything we eat and all of our pets, dogs, right, all that's been artificially selected. So I think your authors were thinking, well, people are already familiar with artificial selection, so let's give that a term, since they may not have known that's what it's called, and then say, okay, since you already know that, here's natural selection, which is the same thing, other than the fact that Darwin didn't know who was choosing the traits. Yeah. So it's all about choosing which trait you want, for the next selection or the next generation, and so on and so on and so on. Like those ghost peppers and what's the other one? Carolina Reapers. All those are, relatively new breeds of peppers, because people just breeding the hottest ones they can and crossbreeding, and that's how that works, because they've been artificially selected for heat. All right, I see. Well, I'll go ahead and take roll here since it's about that time. Cooper is here. Breeden is not here. Davis is online. Elias is not here. Lloyd is online. O'Brien is here. Hamrick is not here. Ray is online. Pena is not here. Michael Baumgartner is here. Sigmund is not here. I think I already said Pena. I don't know. Pena's not here. Bayard, not here. Johnson is online. Sullivan, not here. Hill is online. Byrne is not here. Tyrus is here. Lacey is online, I think. Yep, there's Lacey. Thornabar is here. Fitzpatrick is not here. Hamlet is not here. And Huffman is not here. Have I missed anybody? All right, pretty nice and easy. Only announcement today is I went to check all the pre-labs, and in theory, the labs, because I figured some people probably already did this week's lab, the ecological footprint lab, because they didn't want to have to come in prior to me telling them that they wouldn't have to anyway. Anyway, when I went in there, every single one of them's empty. Every single pre-lab, every single lab. So clearly there's a glitch. I know for sure that not every single one of you didn't, I'm sure most of you actually did do it. So I'm trying to figure out what's wrong with that. In the meantime, if you can, just go in and share it with me like you normally would. And if you've already shared it with me, I guess just do it again so we can figure out what's going on. You guys don't need to worry about anything. If there's anything wrong, clearly something's wrong with the system. So if we can't figure it out, then that lab just won't count for anything. So it's not going to hurt you. But yeah, just wanted to let you know. And that's why none of you have gotten grades for it yet, Because, usually I'll go in there and at least say, hey, you can fix this by this date and all that. Or, hey, just to remind you, this is due on this date. But, yep, so that's the story with this lab. Like I said, if you can, go in, take a look at it, reshare it with me. Maybe even hit the submit button. Normally I say don't do that, but who knows? We got to try something. I don't know what happened. Any questions about that lab or anything else for that matter? All right, let's get back into chapter 13. Natural selection. Actually, I'm going to close the door. I'm sorry, I misspoke. I said chapter 13, natural selection. That's not true, right? Chapter 13 is about evolution. Like I pointed out a couple times yesterday or Wednesday. Natural selection is just one of the ways evolution occurs. It's the main way, so that's what we talk about the most. But that's what we just started talking about at the end of the class on Wednesday. We talked about what Darwin knew and what he started to figure out. And we talked about how he figured, all right, if artificial selection can create really huge, really huge dogs and really tiny dogs and really huge horses and really tiny horses and red apples and green apples, all these things that humans have selected for. If that can happen, he figured then in nature the same thing can happen. And I'm going to back up and say one key point before we move forward to remind you what we said last week or yesterday. The essence of natural selection is unequal reproduction. So that's an important point. And prior to that, I was talking about this guy named Malthus, who's basically saying, wars and famine and disease and for the human species is all basically because of overpopulation, because you have people fighting for resources. So when resources become scarce, then you have conflict. And diseases, like I shouldn't say surely, but I would imagine the virus that caused COVID-19 would not be here, possibly, if we didn't have such a dense human population in some places, and if our population wasn't encroaching into the natural world. So that's a good example. Anyway, again, natural selection, unequal reproduction, meaning that there's going to be more offspring than nature can handle. And because of that, it's only going to be the ones that are just really perfect, like the ones that are better than their siblings, that are going to survive. And what's going to make them better? Well, certain traits, right? So let's talk about it. Let's talk about natural selection in action. The next slide is just going to be a little preview for what we're about to talk about, so there's no notes to be taken if you don't want to. But evolutionary change has been documented in thousands of scientific studies. I guess your book's trying to say a couple things with that little point. First of all, it's nothing new. Second of all, it's well documented. And third, I guess, maybe they're also trying to say this, is we're just going to scratch the surface, right? We're going to give you some examples. But just know that there's many, many, many more examples than what I'm about to give you. I think the biggest example your book gives, or one of the biggest, is this idea that natural selection is in action when you see something like pesticide resistance. So what happens in that? And you don't need to know this. This is just an example, so you can give your note writing hands a break if you want. What happens with this in this situation is there's a small amount of poison initially, or a small amount of poison that's applied to like a field of corn or something, right? You're trying to kill the insects that are eating it. So what happens is, you kill most of them, right? You kill most of the insects that you're trying to kill. However, some of them survive. So then you spray again. Then you kill some of those. But then some survive. Then you spray again, right? You keep going this round after round after round. And every time you do that, every time you spray the poisoning, you're killing the weakest of them, right? So it's the strongest of them, the ones that have whatever inside of them that helps them resist this pesticide. Those are the ones that survive. And therefore, those are the ones that reproduce. And therefore, their offspring are probably stronger than they were because they have a mixture of those two genes or the set of genes from their parents. And that's what happens. And that's what this next slide shows. I don't know why your book chose insects that look like cockroaches, but there you go. And I like how they kind of gave it a color code as if we're talking about, as if it was just one gene. And it might be, who knows. But we're looking at like one gene. And you can see this population up top. It might be hard for you online. But what we're looking at up top is this population has two alleles, a green one and a red one. right? And whatever it is about that red version of that gene, right, the red allele, something about that made that one insect resistant to the pesticide. So naturally, all the weak ones died off, other than these two that had the right genes. So then those are the two that mate in the next generation. Therefore, the generation after that is full of insects with that red allele. And of course, it's just an example. There is no green allele, red allele. There's probably more than one gene involved. But that's a great visualization. The idea here is that with natural selection in action, again, we see this happening. We know natural selection's happen. You can argue if you want that that's not how humans came to be. That's a completely different discussion. But we do see natural selection in action, and that's a great example. Another great example is antibiotics and bacteria resistance, but we'll talk about that towards the end of the chapter. So any points on that example? If we were still doing independent work, I would say that'd be a great independent work topic. Look up other examples of natural selection currently happening, and it is happening. I mean, look at COVID, the Delta variant, all these variants, right? That we started with the one version of the virus that causes COVID-19, but then as it mutates, there's probably been millions of mutations, but we don't know about most of them because if they're not helpful to the virus, they just die off. Whoever had it doesn't affect them, or they can't pass it along, whatever the case is. But it's the strong versions, the stronger, newer versions, they're the ones that get passed along. Which scares me because eventually we might get to a point where our vaccines don't work at all. Anyway, next thing we'll talk about are some key points about natural selection. I like how your book talks about this. It points out that natural selection is more of an editing process than a creative mechanism. And I'll let that soak in. Any guesses to what I might mean by that? What your book might mean? What do you mean more editing than creating?
Because whatever the process is affecting is already alive.
Yes, I like that.
And it edits it by affecting it the way that it does. Meaning, if we're stronger, we move on.
Right.
If we're weaker, we shut the door.
That's perfect, yeah. The idea here is that you're editing something that already existed. So when you guys did that peppered moth simulation, I mean, yeah, they talked about how those peppered moths came to be and it was a mutation in the DNA. But remember, natural selection didn't cause the original dark moths. It caused the population to change. And like he said, it was editing what was already there. There was a bunch of white ones, there was a few dark ones. So it was edited to say, all right, well, the light colored ones went away. Another way you could look at this, and this is the same concept, just said a different way. In a sense, this is the difference between artificial selection and natural selection, in a sense. Because in artificial selection, yeah, it's already, the variation's already there. But in this case, it's on purpose. So there's two different ways to look at it. The first and most important one is what Thornabar said, which is that you're editing it, meaning you're not creating anything. You're just editing what's there. You're deleting some things, you're amplifying other things that are already there. And another way of looking at it is that, again, with artificial selection, there was a goal in mind. Someone wanted a big red apple or a tiny little horse. So humans selected for that. In nature, there is no goal in mind. It's just whatever happens to be most advantageous, that's what passes along. And again, that's just natural selection. Sometimes that doesn't include the other types of evolution. Sometimes things that don't work so well are passed along. Like, again, the fact that humans can't make vitamin C. There's no advantage to not being able to make vitamin C. It just so happens that it didn't make us go extinct, and we found ways around it. So because of that, we still have that broken gene, that broken allele, but we still survive. So yeah, that's basically it. Any questions about that?
Yes.
Yes.
We look at artificial selection as a creative mechanism.
I think so. And if you couldn't hear online, can we look at artificial selection as a creative mechanism? And in a way, yes. Only by the second way I described that, being that in nature, it's not on purpose. It's just whatever happens to be advantageous, that's what gets passed along. In artificial selection, it's creative in that some human decided, I want a tiny little piece of crap yappy dog, sorry, a Yorkie, So they turned a regular dog after thousands of generations into this tiny little yappy dog that you just really don't like. I won't get into that, but anyway, yeah. Also, another point here. This third bullet point is a good one too. An organism may, in its lifetime, acquire characteristics that help it survive, but those acquired characteristics can't be passed on to offspring necessarily. So I don't know. I'll think about that bullet point, and maybe I'll come up with a completely separate video to talk about that and give a lot of examples. But basically, if something gets stronger in its lifetime or learns how to do something, that's not going to get passed along, at least not by their genes. So therefore, that doesn't account for natural selection. This next slide is basically what we're saying, kind of rewording it in a different way. Natural selection is not goal-directed, unlike artificial selection, right? Artificial selection says, I want this really big oval-shaped watermelon as opposed to this round-shaped watermelon, right? So humans, they bred it and bred it and bred it until they got what they were looking for. Natural selection doesn't do that. And I also love that second part. It does not lead to perfectly adapted organisms. And I've already talked about it, so I'll just say really quickly, just the one example. Humans with vitamin C, right? We're not perfectly adapted. Otherwise, we'd be able to make vitamin C. But again, that mutation happened to not kill us, so it survived. Also, think about dolphins and whales, right? They breathe out of one hole, they eat with another. We do both from the same hole. That's so dangerous. That's why people choke a lot, right? If you're breathing and eating and drinking all out of the same tube, accidents can happen, right? So evolutionarily speaking, that's not the perfect adaptation. But another thing to consider is that a trait that is favorable in one situation may be useless or even detrimental in a different circumstance. I'll use these talons as an example of function and form, right? So you can tell by looking at things. What do you think the purpose of these claws are? Not very specifically, very broadly. What do you think they're for? You think they're for helping to fly, helping to pick a booger, helping to catch something, right? And they're superbly adapted to that. But obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously. Let's just assume that they probably didn't start like that. I'm sure you guys have seen other little bird claws, right, that look normal or relatively normal. But over thousands of generations, they probably came to look like that because that helped them get more food, therefore survive, therefore pass along those genes that made it. Now, if it kept going and you had these huge clunky claws that you couldn't even work with, then you wouldn't catch the fish. So there probably has been some eagles or whatever born that way where their parents had really big ones. So together they have huge ones and it was just not advantageous. And they probably maybe just couldn't catch as many fish as their peers. And therefore they didn't have as much to eat. Therefore they died and didn't pass along those genes. So again, a trait can be favorable in one situation, detrimental in another. And I'll give some other examples of that later. Any questions about that? All right. This is where it gets a little bit more interesting, I think. The evolution of populations. So now, now we're going to kind of back up again and consider all of evolution, not just natural selection. So remember, natural selection is a subcategory of evolution. So now we're going to back it up. We're looking at evolution as a whole again. And it's a good time to point this out, even though it's a bullet point, kind of like a table of contents bullet point, so to speak. It's still an important thing. Remember, if you get any questions on the exam, populations are the only thing that evolve, meaning a group of species, right? Not one single one of those moths in that situation in your lab, which remember, that was a real life situation. That wasn't hypothetical. Not one single moth changed colors. A white moth was always white. A black moth was always black. Nothing changed. Not one single moth. The population changed because all the light ones were getting picked off and all the dark ones were surviving. So only populations evolved. Anyway, any questions so far? All right, the next slide is kind of an introduction to what we're about to talk about, and it's reiterating some things we've already talked about. Darwin did not know how variations that are the raw material for natural selection arise in a population. So again, thinking about the dark moths. If he, I don't know what he knew about those, that was about his time frame, but if he was paying attention then hopefully he would think to himself, okay, I've seen all these light colored moths. Now all of a sudden there's dark colored moths. Where did that dark colored moth come from? Where did that variation come from? He didn't know. We know, because I emphasized it in the last section, the last exam, came from mutation. So anyway, yeah, he didn't know this first bullet point, and that's mutation. He didn't know how these variations were passed along from parent to offspring, meaning we didn't know anything about genetics yet. Remember, Mendel was just figuring out the numbers of genetics. He knew if you cross this with this, then you can expect a 1 to 3 to 1 ratio, whatever. He figured out the mathematics, but he had no idea what was going on in the cell. So any questions about this little intro? All right, like I already said, let's talk about the sources of genetic variation. Your book points out that individual variation occurs in all species. That's not important for the exam, but that's important to remember. And that's sometimes hard to remember. It's easy when you think about humans, because we're really just looking at humans, so I can look at all of you guys and see the differences. Now, if you think about like a specific species of grass, even me as a biologist, if you were to like show me a bunch of, that's a Bermuda grass plant, that's a Bermuda grass plant, right? If they were all grown in their own pot and said, hey, look at these different Bermuda grasses. Look at the differences. I mean, I don't see it. To me, they would all look the same. But there is variation there, whether or not you see it. Like I said, sometimes there's obvious physical differences like you might see in humans, but also sometimes there's phenotypic variation only observed at the molecular level. Meaning, think about cystic fibrosis, because we talked about that as one of those things in genetics, one of those diseases. You can't see somebody and say, oh yeah, he's carrying cystic fibrosis, he has it. You can't, well, sometimes you can see if somebody has it, but generally speaking, there's things inside you that you cannot see. Yeah, I can make a whole different video talking about all those examples, but we've already talked about some of them. So moving forward, not all variations in population is heritable. We already know that. And again, that's a key point. It has to be inherited. If it's not inherited, it doesn't matter as far as natural selection is concerned, because it is only the genetic component of variation that is relevant to natural selection. In other words, this is like a really long-winded way of saying what we've already said. But last time we said it, we were talking about artificial selection. To do it, you have to have all this variation, right? And the variation has to be heritable. So we're saying the same thing, we're saying it in the context of natural selection instead of artificial. It's pretty simple, but it's also very important. So are there any questions on this slide? Of course, if you can tell, that picture on the right is just a whole lot of human faces. So again, I think us being humans, we can see variation. We can see like wider faces, skinnier faces, longer faces, shorter faces, wider nose, skinnier nose, longer nose, round eyes, squintier eyes, close together eyes, far away eyes, right? We can see all that variation. But your book gives this example. That's all the same species of snake, garter snakes. But there's variations, right? There's variations in that population. Where does all this variation come from? And this is a big, important point, so you need to definitely know it for the exam, because I mentioned it when we first talked about them. And now we're talking about them in this context. Mutations. New alleles originate by mutations. And as you already know from chapter 10, mutations are a change in the nucleotide sequence of DNA. It is the ultimate source of genetic variation that serves as the raw material for natural selection. Without that one white moth having some sort of mutation to produce dark-colored offspring, that whole thing with the peppered moths would not have happened. That was a random mutation. Any questions about that? All right, here's a little bit of interesting stuff your book points out. In multicellular organisms, it's only the mutations in the cells that produce gametes that matter. Right? So you can get blasted by radiation on your arm, or get a horrible sunburn on your back, and it could mutate your DNA, and well, that might cause cancer. But that's not going to affect your offspring, because you don't make gametes. You don't make sperm or egg from your arm cells or from your back cells, right? That comes from your testes or your ovaries. So for it to be passed along in any multicellular organism, it has to be those sex cells, right? Any questions about that? All right. A change as small as a single nucleotide in a gene can have a significant effect on a phenotype, just like sickle cell. So again, we're talking about sickle cell again. We've brought it up before. We're bringing it up in a different context. Remember, that was that whole gene, and in that whole gene, there was one letter that was swapped. And when you change that one letter, then you change that one amino acid from one to another. That's it. But because of that changing that one amino acid, the whole protein have a different shape. And therefore, all those blood cells have a different shape. And then you have that whole laundry list of things that were detrimental. But the reason it's important and slightly different in this context is, does anybody know which population of humans mostly, has more sickle cell than, per capita than other populations? Yeah, mostly people from sub-Saharan Africa, right? Like you said, black. But yeah, this direct descendants from sub-Saharan Africa. And does anybody know why that might be? Mm-hmm. So malaria is a disease that kills a lot of people, and that's carried by mosquitoes. So places like sub-Saharan Africa and other places where mosquitoes might carry or might be prevalent, it's a very common disease. Now, the way malaria works is it infects your blood cells. It's not a bacteria or virus. It's an actual protist. Anyway, it goes in there. It gets inside your blood cell. It reproduces so much until your blood cell explodes. And then they're out in your bloodstream and they reinfect new blood cells, and then the process continues. But it can't do that for a sickle cell, because remember, sickle cells have those really weird shapes. So that actually, even though they have all that laundry list of bad stuff for them, also it sort of makes them immune to sickle cell disease. Therefore, they survive more than the people who don't have it. Therefore, they would pass along their genes. Therefore, people who have direct descendants from sub-Saharan Africa are more likely to have it than somebody who have direct descendants from Northern Europe. Right? So that's just an example. Anyway, your book also points out, because what I just described was one very random change having, on one hand, a very detrimental effect, but on the other hand, a very good effect. But a random change in an organism's DNA is not likely to improve its genome any more than randomly changing some words on a page is likely to improve a story. And I like how your book brings that up after this, because, again, that top bullet point is like, hey, here's a random change that made a huge difference. In one case bad, in one case good. But there's a lot of random changes that happen that don't even matter. As a matter of fact, that's a lot of how DNA fingerprinting works. You have random changes that haven't really affected you, but the letters are still different. Any questions about that? All right. A mutation that affects a protein's function will probably be harmful. Again, sickle cell is a great example of that, because, again, it's bad, right? We know the sickle cell disease, the things that come along with it are bad. But again, on the other hand, it could be good in the right situation. But on rare occasions, a mutated allele may improve the adaptation of an individual to its environment. It may enhance its reproductive success. And this is more likely when the environment is changing in such a way that mutations that were once bad are now good. So obviously what we have here at the bottom is sickle cell. We've already talked about it. And that's a real life situation. So here, I know it's hard for you to see online, but you can see those red blood cells at the bottom here. Well, the two in the middle, kind of off colored and got little yellow things in them. That's malaria that's infected the blood cells, and they've busted open the blood cells. So that's a real life example. Here's a different example that I've kind of made up. This large fella here. So humans, we love fat, for the most part, humans love fatty foods and sweet foods, right? Because that's evolution, that's natural selection. Because if you have that craving for stuff, now we don't think about it. But prior to that, animals need high calorie stuff. And they don't need to be going around foraging for stuff. They need like a really high calorie meal so they don't spend a lot of time and effort and risk their lives going to find food. So because of that, we are genetically predisposed to like all this stuff we shouldn't like, sweets and fats, because that's high calorie. So back in the day, that was good, because again, you're not going around collecting celery. You're like, here's a good piece of meat, good piece of red meat, right? So that would be good. But because of that, humans now are largely overweight, because not only are we good at finding those things and craving them, but our bodies are also very efficient at storing calories, which is really good in nature. Not so good for humans, because we don't have an issue with not having enough food. Most humans have plenty of food, and because of that, we eat too much food, and our body's really good at storing that energy. and it's bad for our health. Now, let's assume this fella right here has different genes than the rest of us. Let's say, even though you can't tell, he runs 5 miles a day and he's on a strict diet. He's just really fat, right? But let's assume that's because there's some kind of malfunction in one of his genes that really makes him store the food away. It really slows down his metabolism. And because of that, his body's really good at storing food. Now, right now, in the current environment, that would be bad. He'll probably die of some sort of heart disease thing, or maybe complications with diabetes. I don't know. Now, let's just assume, though, that World War III kicks off and most of the human population's dead. Nuclear bombs are exploding, so we lose the breadbasket. We lose all this agricultural land, and now it's a struggle to survive, and most humans now all of a sudden can't find food again. In that situation, this guy's going to be an advantage again because he doesn't need as many calories as the rest of us, because whatever mutations he has, it has slowed down his metabolism, and his body's really good at storing that energy. So that's obviously a hypothetical example, but it's the same kind of situation as the real example of the sickle cell, which is that in one situation it might be bad, then in another it might be good. And again, in real life, humans having that ability to crave unhealthy food and eat it and store that energy is actually a bad thing now, even though it started off as a good thing. Another great example of how natural selection isn't perfect, because if it was, we would have already evolved past that, right? It would only be the humans like, man, I could really go for some carrots and celery right now. Those would be the ones that are passing along those genes more, but it doesn't happen that way. Your book also points out that chromosomal mutations that delete, disrupt, or rearrange many genes at once, those are most likely to be bad, right? So remember when we talked about mutations, we talked about one little one, which is like sickle cell, right? That was a substitution. You swapped out one letter. Then we talked about some bigger ones where it's just where like an insertion or a deletion where everything downstream was messed up. That would probably be more harmful because that's not some small little change. That's a huge change. Or remember we talked about errors when there's crossing over. So you might like have a huge chunk of chromosome missing or have a big chunk of chromosome added on. If it's big, it's more likely to be harmful. But in some cases, duplications of genes or small pieces of DNA through errors in meiosis can provide important sources of genetic variation and eventually lead to new genes with novel functions. I wish I could remember the example. Humans can see, oh man, I can't think right now, but we can see different colors than some other creatures because we have more receptors in our eyes than some other creatures, but some other creatures have more receptors than we do, so they can see more colors than we can. But the way it arose, I do remember this, for humans, is that we have more copies of certain genes. So this is new to you. I haven't said this before. So because I keep saying, this gene is on this chromosome and that gene is on that chromosome. But now you know that for some genes, there are multiple copies of them. And you could imagine, generally speaking, the result of that is if you have multiple copies of that gene, you're going to have more of whatever it is that gene produces, obviously, right? Because the gene is just instructions on how to produce something. So if you have more of it, more of the instructions, you're going to have more of the production. But obviously, you have more of a chance of one of those genes, one of those many copies to have a mutation. So now you've got all your original many other copies, and now you have one new one, which is the idea right there. Eventually lead to new genes with novel functions. Anyway, any questions about that? I guess I should talk about attendance for those of you online. Today's word, well, at least one word, is going to be chair. So if you're online, the first word you're going to send me for attendance will be chair, like the thing you sit in. Or if you're the best tuba player in the band, your first chair tuba. Whatever. Your book also points this out. I might not ask you about it. But again, so far we've been talking about humans, which are eukaryotes. But let's talk about prokaryotes really quickly, which I'll remind you of things like bacteria. They're not as complicated as we are. They don't have 2 chromosomes, right? They don't have pairs of chromosomes. They've got 1 chromosome. And because of that, mutations arise a lot quicker, right? So if you mess up one of their alleles, that's it, right? That's their only copy. So then once they go through mitosis and make a perfect copy of themselves, it's going to go and go and go and copy and copy and copy. With humans, if you have a mutation in your allele, it's a 50-50 chance that when you produce your sperm or your egg, that you're going to pass along that mutated version. You might pass on the regular version. So yeah, Basically, with prokaryotes, it happens quicker for that reason. Also, prokaryotes generally, they reproduce a lot quicker. Anyway, any questions about that? For animals and plants, like I've already hinted at, it's a lot slower. Your book gives you some numbers. The average is about 1 mutation for every 100,000 genes per generation. So, for every 100,000 genes your parents had, on average, they had 1 mutation in one of them. And now you're going to have 1 mutation for every 100,000 genes that you have. Well, your generation. Sorry, I shouldn't say you, per generation. Anyway, that's not a number you need to know. Point here is that they come around a lot slower for eukaryotes, for plants and animals. Also, like I said, bacteria, they generate quickly, right? They reproduce quickly. Humans, plants, animals, there's usually a long time span in between generations. There's definitely some exceptions to that rule, but generally speaking, and relatively speaking, there's a longer time span. All right, any questions about that? Okay, let's also kind of on the same note talk about something similar, which is sexual reproduction. In sexually reproducing organisms, most genetic variation in a population is from a unique combination of alleles that each individual inherits. And you already know that because when we talked about meiosis, we were talking about the origins of genetic variation, other than mutations, right? You had the crossing over. You had all the things that happened in prophase 1. You had independent assortment, all that stuff, right? We already talked about that. So there's a fresh assortment of existing alleles that arise every generation. Again, yeah, we've already talked about all this stuff. So remember, the independent orientation of homologous chromosomes, meaning if your mom's chromosomes are black and your dad's chromosomes are red, it's not like they all line up like this. Imagine me doing that 23 times, right? Because you have 23 pairs of chromosomes. They don't all do like mom on one side and dad on the other when they line up. They could. The chances are really low, but they could. No, remember what happens is they just do that randomly. There is no rhyme or reason to how they line up. Mom on one side, dad on the other, right? There is no rhyme or reason, and that is independent assortment. Remember, we figured out that there was what? Trillions of different combinations of sperm and egg that you could get. Meaning, like if you were to look at every single sperm in your body or every single egg in your body, you would probably get a different variation for each one of those. Anyway, we've already talked enough about that. I just want to remind you. So are there any questions? All right. Like I already said earlier, it's populations that evolve, right? Populations evolve. Individuals do not evolve. The evolutionary impact of natural selection is only apparent in the changes in the population over time. So again, with those peppered moths, not one single moth changed colors. Not one. It was the group of moths that changed over time, from being mostly light moths and fewer dark moths to mostly dark moths and fewer light moths. And this is a good time, even though I've already kind of hinted at it. No, I've even said it, but now you officially know the definition of population. And you need to know this because I'm bringing it up in this chapter and I'm going to bring it up in other chapters. You need to know the definition of a population. It's a group of individuals of the same species that live in the same area and interbreed. In other words, because who cares about the book definition, what we're talking about is it's just a bunch of things that are the same species living together. I mean, yeah, interbreed, but as far as we're concerned, they're interbreeding. You might look it up somewhere else and it might say they live in the same area at the same time and interbreed. And that's true too, obviously. But of course, if you're not in the same area at the same time, you can't interbreed. So if it were me, if I were writing that definition, I might just say a group of individuals of the same species that interbreed, right? What if they're not in the same area? Well, actually, we'll talk about that later with gene flow. But generally speaking, if they're the same species and they're interbreeding, that's a population. This is in a different context when we talk about it later. What we've talked about, remember way back to chapter 1 where we had that thing that showed when we went from like atoms to molecules to organelles to cells to organisms to, and that's where we get here, populations, which is a group of the same species. Next, you're going to learn about something called a community, which is a group of different species. Then you're going to learn about something called an ecosystem, which is that same group of interacting species, but also now including influences of the environment. But anyway, you know what a population is now. That's important. Different populations of the same species may be geographically isolated from each other. So again, your book's pointing out the fact that, yeah, in some sense, they do need to be close enough to each other, at least close enough to breed. Because of that, the exchange of genetic material may never or rarely occur, and that would make them different populations, right? If they're not interbreeding with each other, at least regularly, then that's going to be different populations. Yes, it's the same species, but it could be different populations. It's hard because I think when we think of populations, we think of humans, because we talk about the human population all the time. And for humans, we're almost all one population in a sense, as far as this is concerned, because we do such a good job of moving around and mating, that for humans it's kind of different. But think about, I don't know, a population of Japanese maple in West Virginia versus a population of Japanese maple in Japan. Might be the same species, but they are not breeding. Such isolation is common in populations confined to different lakes or islands. The Galapagos Islands is a great example of that. That's why each island has its own turtle. Yeah, the islands are close. But remember, those turtles were ginormous, and they weren't like the sea-going turtles. They were the kind that lived on land. So because of that, they all kind of evolved separately, and they weren't exchanging genes. Therefore, they looked a lot different over time. Meanwhile, the marine iguanas, they looked similar throughout all the islands. Why? Because of the marine iguanas. So they weren't isolated because they just swim from island to island. Anyway, here's a good example from your book. Pretty sure this picture's from your book. There's a bunch of lakes, right? So you might have the same species of fish A that lives in that pond, and also the same species that lives in this pond, and the same species that live in that pond, and so on and so forth. The fish, generally speaking, they don't get up out of the ponds and walk to other ponds, right? Generally speaking, that's not happening. So because of that, even though those are different species, even though that might be the same species, those are different populations. And as far as evolution is concerned, here's why that's important. Because the species in pond A, look, that's a big pond, right? Then you have, I shouldn't put A there. The species in this pond, the population in this pond, is living in a much different environment than the population in that pond, right? Maybe let's assume this one's a lot deeper and has colder water, and that other smaller one's a lot shallower and has warmer water. So because of that, there's a difference, right? So if you thrive in warm water, you're going to do better in one than the other. Maybe the predators are different. So maybe in one case, if you're faster, it's an advantage. Maybe in another case, if you're a better hider, it's an advantage. But all these different environments will eventually lead to this one species maybe becoming different species because of all the changes in their environments and all those changes in their evolution that might lead them to be different species. But again, just to point out the fact that yes, sometimes even then, they can still mate with each other. Like what if an eagle swoops into that pond on the left, grabs a fish, it's flying off with it, accidentally drops it in the other pond, right? So there you go. Now they've interbred again. But generally speaking, that doesn't happen. Any questions about that picture or this concept that, you can have populations close to each other of the same species, but they're still not the same population because technically they're not interbreeding. All right, let's talk about a concept that you should be familiar with because you've already done the lab. Well, some of you haven't done the lab, and it's not too late. You should still go back and do it for half credit. But gene pools. You need to know what a gene pool is. That is all copies of every type of allele at every locus in all members of the population. In other words, it's basically this is the genomes of everybody in a population, right? It's the genomes and everybody in a population. All the different versions of all the same of the alleles, right? So remember, alleles are different versions of genes. So a good example of that would be, eye color in humans. Like let's say, I'm just throwing a number out there that 40% of humans have blue eyes and 60% don't, right? So 40% of those people have the blue eye allele, don't. Just an example. But again, that's us looking at a gene pool. Of course, then I've kind of zoomed in, so to speak, and when I've talked about one particular allele. But the gene pool itself, we're talking about all the genes, all the variations, every single individual in the population. Now that's the easy part. Knowing what a gene pool is relatively easy. The hard part is this next part, which is analyzing gene pools. And that's what that lab was all about, the Hardy-Weinberg lab. Still see notes, so I'll slow it down for a second. The next word for attendance is sticker. Like when your kids go to the dentist, they might get a little sticker, a little SpongeBob sticker or whatever. So yeah, let's talk about analyzing gene pools. And again, you're familiar with the concept because that's what you did, but now we can really talk about it. And again, I know some of you haven't haven't even looked at the that lab. I don't know why, but here, this is good because now you can get a little better pre-lab lecture, so to speak. You'll understand it a little bit more going into it. So let's imagine this hypothetical wildflower situation here. What colors do you see? How many different colors? Well, kind of a bad picture. Let's forget these don't exist. Maybe it's just the coloring of the picture. But yeah, look, you have red ones and white ones, right? Two varieties. Now, let's assume that the allele for the red flower, which is big R, will be dominant to the allele for the white flower. And here's where we get into the Hardy-Weinberg formula. The genotype frequencies can be calculated from the allele frequencies if the gene pool is not evolving. And here's where you guys, let me just skip ahead to this. This is what you guys need to know and what I think you guys were not getting in the lab. We know the allele frequencies and we know the genotype frequencies. And another way of saying this, and I wish somebody would have said this back when I was first learning it, frequencies, you could almost get rid of that word and think of percentages or fractions. And I'll give you an example. Allele frequencies. So let's say, I don't know, how many of you had dimpled chins in here? Well, this would be easy. Good. So, for example, remember, dimpled chins are dominant, right? We went big D, or big D, little d. That was the dimpled chin phenotype, right? Little d was the smooth chin phenotype because, again, it's the little d, that allele was the one. So in our situation, this is going to be easy. For the allele sequences, let's say P is the dominant and Q is the recessive. How many, percentage-wise, do we have in here that have the little d? No, I mean, I'm not talking hypothetically. Because remember, little one, sorry. We all have smooth chins, right? So that means none of us have the big D, which means in our case, if we were doing it percentages-wise, it would be this. Because nobody has dimpled chins in here. So 0% plus 100% equals 100%, right? So that's where you guys, I think some of you guys are messing this up. When you were looking at the allele frequencies, they always had to add up to 100%. Or more specifically, because we weren't doing percentages in some of them, they all have to add up to 1. So let's assume it was 50-50. No, let's do something different. Let's say it was 0.6. If somehow we knew that this, and there was more people, let's say we knew that 0.6 of the population of the alleles were the Q. What would this be? 0.4, yes, because they have to equal 1. 0.4 plus 0.6 equals 1. Again, really quick for the simple math. If this was 0.2, then this would have to be what? 0.8, good. Because they all have to equal the whole. That's all. Then with this is the same thing. It looks a little bit more complicated because P squared and 2PQ and Q squared, and I'll show you why later, because there is some algebra that can be done, and it is important, but you won't have to do it. But this, instead of being just the alleles, this is the genotype. Homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and recessive. That's it. So, again, let's say, and they all still have to equal to 1. So if this was, I don't know, 0.3, and this was 0.4, then what would this have to be? But that's 0.3 and 0.4. So together those make up 0.7. So would this have to be? Yeah, I think you said it, right? Yeah, 0.3, right? Because they always have to equal to 1. And I did see mistakes on this on your tables. Because if your allele frequencies didn't add up to 1, and your genotype frequencies didn't add up to 1, then that's an issue. Or, talk about this. If you said, because remember at the end of it, you had to say which changed, what didn't change. If you said, okay, this one went up, but everything else stayed the same. That's impossible, because remember, they all have to add it to 1. So we know that if this one goes up, one or both of those had to go down. Or, I don't know, if this one went down, then we know one or both of these has to go up. It has to, because they all equal 1. So anyway, that's an important concept. Big picture. And again, we're just talking about the percentages, so to speak. You have more of this allele or less of this allele. You have more of this genotype, less of this genotype, more of that genotype, right? It has to all equal to 1 as the whole. Now, it looks complicated again because it actually says p squared and q squared and 2pq. And I'm going to show you how we use that in genetics, in biology, but you're not going to have to do it. And when we get back, that is what we will do. So the last word for attendance is going to be microphone. Like all I need is one microphone. Any questions? All right, I will be online for office hours if you need me.
Mrs. V, I got a question.
Yeah.
About the lab 10. I heard you talking about it, I believe, and yeah, I don't think I got a grade for it.
Which one was it? The one with the this one with the Hardy Weinberg. We're looking at the different fish.
Yeah.
I'll go in and double check, but I'm pretty. Yeah, you got a grade because I remember off the top of my head you got extra credit too because you did the video.
Oh yeah. Oh, okay. I just didn't see the grade on the side of it, so I was kind of confused.
That's where I thought I put it. Double check. I'll also double check on my end. If you go back and see that I didn't do it, let me know.
No, I'm looking at it right now, and I don't see the grade. I mean, I don't see anything on the side of it.
Huh. All right, I'll take a look. But also, don't forget to check the spreadsheet. But yeah, anyway, let me get out of here so I get to the office because there's another class coming in.
Okay.
And I'll check it for you.
All right. Thank you.
No, thank you for letting me know.
All right.